And I'm going to start sharing my screen. Hang on one second. There it is. Okay, there we go. So a couple of things to talk about before we get started. First of all, you can see that today's training is subcontracts. The original schedule for today's date was the periodic performance report, basically the data report, the tool that you're going to use to report your performance throughout the period, throughout the life of the grant. That PPR tool is not quite cooked yet. And so we've rescheduled the PPR to the last Thursday session, which is November 7th. And if you are on my contact list, you should have received yesterday's follow-up email, which attached the revised schedule for the rest of our training series. So today we're going to talk about subcontracts. The other important thing that I wanted to note is that I made a big mistake yesterday when I was introducing you to some of the time recording templates. And I actually showed you our internal PAR form and not the one that is designed for our grantees. So that follow-up email that you received yesterday doesn't include one of the forms that I showed you, because that's not the form you're supposed to use. So I apologize for the confusion. What I'm going to do is I'm going to separately record another video, and I'll send that out separately today, that introduces you to the correct forms. So I apologize again for the confusion, but hopefully between the content, all the principles that I talked about yesterday, and the second recording that will show you the correct form and how to use it. Between those two, I hope that I'll have set you on the right path, but my apologies for that. So let's get started with subcontracts. So as always, we're gonna, whoops, there we go. The usual first slides. We are keeping you muted throughout the call because we are recording it, and we want to have a high quality recording to send out to you. But we do care about what your questions and comments are, so please use the chat box to pose any questions, and we'll pause periodically, and Megan will help me with those questions and we'll answer them. We're still building our contact list, so if you have other folks at your agency that you think would benefit from participating in these trainings and receiving those invitations and receiving the follow-up emails, then please use the cja.r3training@illinois.gov email address to share that contact information with me, because the follow-up email will always give you the recording of that day's session, the PDF of the PowerPoint that we use, and kind of a summary of any of the key points. But when you do have additional folks you want to be added to the contact list, please be sure to give me their name, their role in the grant, as well as their email address. So today's training is going to be a little longer and is going to be a little more involved. We're going to talk about these subjects. We're going to talk about the difference between a subaward and a subcontract. For us, those are two very different things. We're going to review some of the subcontract components, our approval process, and then we'll get to the upcoming trainings. So let's dive right into the difference between a subaward and a subcontract. Now, this is the lawyer language from our policy. Basically, it's saying that, if a partner agent, another entity that's going to be receiving funds from you through this grant, if they're doing a part of the program, they're likely to be a subrecipient. That's a subaward. But if the agency receiving the funds through you for this program is just providing services that are not part of the program, then that's likely to be a subcontract. Let's talk about the difference in some detail. So a subcontractor provides goods and services within normal business hours. They provide the same goods and services to any taker, to any customer. And that's usually done in a competitive environment. And the services that and goods that they provide support the funded program, but they are not providing the funded program. So good examples are, your utilities or professional services like, your contractual trainers or your accountants or advertising that you do. Those are not a part of the program. They just support you in implementing that program. So when we're deciding if it's a subaward or a subcontract, there are two critical questions that we ask. Does that other agency provide services to the grantee agency, or does it provide direct services to your program participants? And is the performance of that other entity, is that reflected in the goals, objectives, and performance measures that you'll be reporting to the authority? So asking the first question, whether or not the agency provides direct services to your program participants, services to the grantee agency are likely subcontracts, like your accounting service, for instance. But if they're providing direct services to your program participants, they're doing part of the program. So that's a subaward. So in this example, your grant is about providing job training, and you are an expert in providing it to young adults, but you want to use some of the funds from this grant to support a partner agency who will be providing the same kind of service to teens. So they're part of the larger program, and they're doing part of the program. They're providing a direct service to your clients. So that's a subaward. The second question is their performance reflected in the goals, objectives, and performance measures? If not, then that's a subcontract. So while your accounting service is a very vital activity, right? They're the ones who's going to, come in and make sure that your books are in good shape and help you pay your bills. You don't have a goal, objective, or performance measure that's going to reflect the work of your accounting agency. They're providing the service to you that helps the program run, but they're not doing the program, and you're not going to be counting reporting their performance to us as part of your goals, objectives, and performance measures. But if the answer to that question is yes, that partner agency that's doing the work with teens while you do work with young adults, you will be reflecting their work as part of your goals, objectives, and performance measures. So that's a subaward. There are some rare instances where we look at these different characteristics of subawards and subcontracts, and sometimes it's really not that black and white. In those rare circumstances where it's hard to determine where they come down as a subaward or a subcontract, we're just going to hand that off to our lawyers in our Office of the General Counsel, and they will make that final determination how we're going to treat that, that other agency as a subrecipient or as a subcontractor. So let's stop there, Megan, and see if there are any questions so far.
No questions yet.
Great. Now let's dive into conflicts of interest. So the basic rule for conflicts of interest is that you have to, the onus is on the grantee to disclose in writing any potential or actual conflicts of interest that may arise as part of this grant. So a conflict of interest is, here's the lawyer language again. No employee, officer, or agent of the grantee shall participate in the selection of a contractor, the award of a contract, administration of a contract, or hiring of personnel supported by grant funds if a conflict of interest that's either real or apparent would be involved. So here are the most common conflict examples that we see. You can't rent space from your own agency or from that of a relative or a partner. You can't contract with agencies or companies in which you or the agency or the principal decision makers in that agency owns or has a financial or non-financial interest. So you can't contract with them. And of course, hiring family members or friends always raises a red flag as well. So let's talk about what that non-financial interest could be. For instance, if you sit on the board of a partner agency and your agency is awarding a contract, a subaward to this agency, you're not getting any, financial gain from that agency where you're a board member. You're not getting any financial gain from that, but the agency that you are helping to run, that you're a board member for, does benefit from that relationship and getting that contract. So that would be a conflict of interest that has a non-financial implication. The cardinal is always that you have to communicate any potential conflicts to your grant specialist. And then we'll talk with the attorneys and we'll figure out the best way to address that potential conflict. Sometimes it may result in the most extreme example with, some costs being disallowed or not approving a contract or a subaward because of that conflict. But typically, what we're trying to do is to address the conflict, but to keep the integrity of the program. So it's always going to be communication with your grant specialist, and we communicate with the attorneys, and we come up with the best guidance to avoid any conflict of interest. Any comments or questions yet?
Yeah, we have a couple. Luke has asked, can you go over the main two questions to ask again on subcontract versus subaward?
Sure. Let me look back there. The two questions are, does the entity provide services to the grantee agency, or does it provide direct services to the program participants? For me, that's, one of the most critical questions. The second one is the work of this other entity reflected in the goals, objectives, and performance measures that you're going to be reporting on a quarterly basis to the authority? So let's think about a trainer. So if you have a contract with a trainer to come in and do the sexual harassment training for your staff, that's a subcontract because they're providing a service to you. But if you have a contract for a subaward, for an agency to come in and do training for your program participants, maybe you're going to do conflict resolution training with your program participants as part of the larger program. That would be direct services to your program participants. And so that would be a subaward. And then it's going to be the work of that trainer who's doing the conflict resolution for your clients. Their performance is going to be reflected in your goals, objectives, and performance measures, right? So for instance, you would want to have a process objective that your participants are receiving this training, and then you would want to have some measure that would reflect the impact of that training. So those are the two big questions that we ask. What other questions do you have, Meg?
I am a single member LLC in the case where independent contractor are hired to fulfill a role such as facilitator. Are they considered subcontractor or subaward?
Let's hold on to that question because I'm going to walk through a couple of different scenarios for subcontracts, and we'll talk about that in a few slides.
Okay. Our grant will be supporting after-school programs. We intend to integrate on-site mental health therapy services. We have done this in the past by both contracting an individual as well as contracting an agency to provide therapy services.
Mhm.
Improving mental well-being is a goal of ours. Would the individual or agency be considered a subboard?
One big difference, let's see, what's the best way to say it? If you contract with an agency to provide those mental health services to your clients, that's a subaward. If you're hiring an individual to provide those services and you are going to give them a W-2 at tax time, then that's a personal services contract. So they're considered a contractual employee. Now, if they're an independent contractor, like I am, Maureen Brennan LLC, then that's a 1099 that they're going to be receiving, not a W-2. They're an entity, not an individual. So instead of being an employee who gets a W-2, that Maureen Brennan LLC is an entity that gets a 1099, and they would be considered a contract. They would be considered a subaward.
That's it for questions.
Okay. So let's talk about the different components of a subcontract. So if it's a subcontract, then it's subject to procurement rules, right? So that means that, I mean, all contracts have to be open and competitive for the selection of the vendor, right? So Maureen Brennan LLC is considered, because I get a 1099, that's going to be a vendor. That partner agency that is your subaward is going to be a little bit different. So we're going to put that aside and we'll talk about that on next Wednesday when we talk about subawards. And the difference too, I mean, this is a really important difference because the paperwork and the approval process for subcontracts and for subawards are really different. And so the subawardees are it's a bigger administrative lift for grantees that have subawards because you're actually going to have to oversee the work of that agency's program, right? So it's a lot of like you kind of mirror the work that we do when we oversee our grantees. A subcontract is a little simpler, but of course it's all subject to open competition for the selection of that vendor. So the paperwork and the approval process for subcontracts kind of does vary by what services or what or goods that you are procuring. So let's look at rent and utilities, for instance. You're not going to issue an RFP for internet services, right? You're not going to issue an RFP probably for, leasing space for your program. But so the standard for that is that you have to kind of determine your needs. What do you need? And, have that standard. And then do a call around or go look at other, space that's available for your program and get, bids. You want to see which of the potential vendors see how well they meet the needs that you've defined. And you want to get bids for them to figure out what the best rate for you is. And then you need to retain records of those bids, right? So you are doing a sort of a modified a very simple procurement process, but you have to define those needs, get some bids, and then retain those records so we can make sure that when we take a look at it, that has been a competitive process. Now, for contractual staff, just like hiring payroll staff, it still has to be an open and competitive hiring process. So again, you have to define the job requirements, just like you were hiring payroll staff, and the hiring criteria. You have to post that job opening, and you have to retain records of the applicant qualifications and interviews. And then you have to execute a written employment contract. So it mirrors what you do when you're hiring payroll employees as well, because it has to be an open and competitive process. Because, remember that, these funds have to go to support the best candidate for the job, and you identify the best candidate for the job through an open and competitive hiring process. Now, for big procurements, like you're going to identify a vendor for for I'm trying to think of a good example. If you're going to identify a vendor to provide a significant service to you, then you're going to need to draft an RFP, a request for proposal. And you're going to have to submit that RFP to the authority for our review and approval. If you're looking to procure equipment, then that's not an RFP, it's an IFB, an invitation for bid. And that too needs to be submitted to the authority for review and approval before it's posted. So let's look at the RFP. So again, you need to define the program or services that you're seeking to procure. You're going to post that RFP after we approve it and give you the okay, to invite applicants to describe how they're going to provide those services. They're going to describe their qualifications to provide those services and the cost to provide those services. So if you think about it, your application for R3 funding is really an RFP, right? We call it a NOFO, but it's really an RFP. We told you what the parameters were, and we invited folks to apply, tell us how they would provide the services within those parameters, told us how you qualified you were to provide that, and then you submitted a budget that detailed those costs. If you were doing, here's the example I should have thought of a second ago. If you were going to do an RFP for accounting services, you're going to describe that, what services, the accounting services that you need. And an applicant, for instance, might say, I've got a team of 3 accountants, here are their qualifications, and we charge $40 an hour. We estimate, the number of hours that it's going to take to provide these services. Here's my estimate for what it would cost to provide the services that you told me that you needed. For an IFB, that's when you're procuring equipment. And I know that doesn't come up very much with our grants, because in our terms, equipment is items that have a unit cost of $5,000 or more. But what you need to do for an IFB is to detail the specifications and the criteria for selection of that equipment. Your bidders are then going to have to provide the equipment the information on the equipment that they'll provide, the cost of the equipment, and then the delivery date, basically saying we can provide the equipment that meets your specifications, this is what it costs, and we can meet this date. And that's really important if you do have to do an IFB. I had a grant a number of years ago where the grantee was procuring an information system, and they did a big IFB for the computers and the servers that they needed to run this system. They didn't do a good job with specifying the equipment that they needed, like the capacity of the equipment. And an IFB is always kind of based on the cost. You say that you meet these basic specifications that were outlined in the IFB, and you can meet the delivery date, and then the real selection criteria is always going to be the lowest cost, right? And so this grantee had to select the lowest cost, and they ended up, it really impaired the implementation of this system, because the equipment that they had to buy, because it was on a low bid kind of basis, they hadn't done a good job of detailing those specifications, and they were stuck using this, and it really did impair the implementation of that program. So no matter which of these tools that we're using, which of these procurement processes, whether it's for, a lease or it's for staff, for contractual staff, for an RFP or an IFB, the best investment of time that you're going to make is really thinking through those specifications and the process, like the criteria that you're going to use to identify the vendor or the contractor that you're going to select. When you make that investment, that'll give you the best outcome. So I need to remind you again that if you are doing an RFP or an IFB, that needs to be submitted to the authority for review and approval prior to posting it. So after that review and approval process, you will receive a letter from your grant specialist that will document the authority approval to post that RFP or IFB, and you cannot post that solicitation until you receive that letter from the authority. Any questions, Megan?
Someone asked, do you have RFP templates examples?
I don't believe that we do provide that. I don't believe that we do. I don't believe that we do, but I would say that if you look at our application, our NOFOs, and obviously you're not going to do a big amplifund kind of a thing, but if you get those principles of like how you describe the services that you need to procure, and then just ask reasonable questions, that the applicants would need to answer for you to make that judgment. You really need to, one of the things that takes a lot of time when we write the NOFO is really thinking through the criteria for the selection process. I'm sorry, I don't believe that we do have any templates or examples that we can offer you. I'll inquire with legal if they can point us in the right direction. And if they can, I'll include that in the follow-up email.
Another question, how long does approval usually take for the RFP?
That really varies based on like the complexity of what you're procuring. That's and how solid the package is when we get it over to legal, because they're going to be looking through. Their legal is the one who really approves it for us. So if it's a pretty straightforward, simple thing, then it may be fairly quick. I hate to give you a timeline. We really want to, move it through. We don't want to impede the implementation of your program. So we'll do it as quickly as possible. But, there's so many factors that go into that approval process, that, timing of that approval process, that I hate to give you like a firm timeline. All I can say is that we do it as expeditiously as possible. Your lawyers won't review a subcontract if we don't have at least a draft agreement. So that we won't, we can't issue that RFP unless we know what the program is about and to see how it fits in. So if you're thinking you may need an RFP, then we won't even be able to take it to the lawyers until we have your draft agreement for them to review in partnership with that RFP. So that's a good non-answer, isn't it?
Last question. Someone is still slightly confused on subawards and subcontracts. Subaward is for a 1099 and 3S.
No. Yeah, so it would be a 1099, like a vendor is a 1099. A staff member and a contractual staff member is going to get a W-2. And so you're going to select that contractual staff member the same way you would any payroll employee. It has to be open to competition, but that would be the standard there. Where a subawardee, somebody's going to get a 1099, that's a vendor. They're providing a part of the services of the program. They're not providing a service to the agency.
That's the last question.
Okie doke. Now let's look at the subcontract package. So the process, if you do have a subcontract for us to review, that draft subcontract needs to go to your grant staff member before the subcontract is executed. And all subcontracts require prior written authority approval. So what's in the package? You probably have a standard contract or your, the lease for the space. Your, landlord has a standard contract that they would, that you would sign, the lease agreement. But we also have the authority subcontract addendum. And we invented this a number of years ago because, government money comes with a lot of requirements, a lot of hoops, a lot of strings. And so instead of having everybody who has a subcontract rewrite their subcontract to incorporate all of these required provisions, what we did is we put all of the required provisions in one package, and that's the subcontract addendum. If you're familiar with the authority, we have both state and federal grants. Our federal, we have separate addendum because there are state requirements, and then if it's federal money, it has all those state requirements plus federal requirements as well. So our legal team has done the work of putting all of these requirements in one package, either for state or federal grants. And so that addendum, it becomes part of the subcontract. It's appended to it and made part of that contract. So your grant specialist can provide you that addendum. And then we also have to make sure, remember when we talked about cost allowability, all costs in the grant budget have to be reasonable and necessary, right? And so we have a contractor rate justification checklist. So we need to make sure that the contractor rate is reasonable for the services that are being provided. And we lay out those criteria. Actually, it's the federal government that laid out those criteria, and we adopted it. So there are different standards. There's different requirements on that checklist of how we justify the rate based on where that rate is relative to the standard that the federal government established. And also, the last piece of the puzzle is we want to make sure that procurement has been open to competition. There are some times when a sole source, when there's only one vendor who can supply the service, that would be a sole source. And so we have another form that needs to be completed to justify that sole source procurement. If it's not a sole source, then we would need a letter that would detail the competitive selection process that you undertook to arrive at this vendor. So let's talk about each piece of it. As I said, that subcontractor addendum is provided by your grant specialist. It puts all of the required provisions in one document that is added on to your standard contract or that of like your landlord for the lease of your space. That contractor rate justification, that certifies that the contractor is charging the usual and customary rate, that they're not charging a higher rate of compensation because this is grant money or that you have that much money available in your budget. So contractors can only charge you what their usual and customary rate is. And so we will often ask for documentation that backs up that this is the contractor's usual and customary rate. This comes up a lot when we talk about trainers, right? I've seen trainers that have asked for $4,000 a day. That seems really high. And so you would need to justify why you're going to use this trainer that's that expensive. But you also need to, the trainer would need to provide proof that that is the rate that they charged everybody, and that's their going rate is $4,000 an hour. So, a day rather, I should say. And here's the sole source justification. There are only a couple of times that a sole source is used. If you do an RFP and you only get one bid, you need to complete the sole source justification that would document that you did this process and only got one application. When there are times when either time or some other factors don't allow for a formal bidding process, you need to, have that training done by a certain date, and it won't, and the time isn't available for you to do a whole RFP process. And you've used this vendor before, this trainer before, and so it's an exigent circumstance, and so we may allow that, but again, we would have to justify it. Oops, we slipped over there. There are times when we have a vendor that is the only source that can supply a service. And the sole source justification is not saying that the vendor that's selected is the best vendor. It's saying that it's the only vendor that can supply the service. There have been times when I've had with grants for technology services, and there is like one vendor that provides this unique service to, enhance a very particular information system. That's a sole source justification because there is no other vendor that can supply this service. And like all subcontracts, sole source procurements must receive prior authority legal approval. So that's part of the package that we would submit to our attorneys for their review and approval. So this package goes to, first it's going to go to your grant specialist, and they're going to review to make sure that it all makes sense. And it all makes sense relative to your grant agreement, right? That's why we can't, we can't review an RFP or we can't review a subcontract until we have that grant agreement, right? It doesn't have to necessarily be executed, but we at least have that draft grant agreement for the lawyers to review, because the two pieces have to make sense together. So your grant specialist may have some questions or ask for some clarification. Once they're satisfied, they're going to pass it over to legal, and they're going to review it. They may ask for revisions or clarifications before they approve it as well. Once they do the approval, your grant specialist will email you a letter confirming that approval. Hang on to that. But you can't incur any subcontract costs before you get that notice of approval. So don't sign the contract, don't incur any costs until you get that letter of approval. The final step, after you do execute this approved contract, is that you will send a copy of a PDF of that signed subcontract to your grant specialist so they can retain it on file. So before we get, I don't have the link yet for the survey. I hope to have it this afternoon so I can send it out with the follow-up email. We have a training next Wednesday on subawards, and we'll walk through that process. And then next Thursday, we're going to start talking about authority site visits. I bet there are some questions, Megan.
You have a couple questions, yes. Someone said, it is my understanding a contracted staff member would get a 1099 individual or business. Do individual contractors go through the same procurement as subcontractor agencies or contractor agencies?
So like I outlined before, the procurement process, is different for what you're procuring, right? So if you're looking for professional services, if that person is going to be considered your contractual employee, they're going to get a W-2 at the end of the year, then you follow the same process as you would for any hiring any payroll staff. But if that the individual is considered an entity, they're not going to get a W-2. They're not, the IRS doesn't consider them your employee. They're considered a vendor, and they're going to get a 1099. Then you would procure their services like you would any other vendor.
Next question. If we already have a multi-year lease agreement because it was required to apply for the grant, do we need to have our landlord sign the addendum?
Let's talk with legal about that. Typically, I believe we do have them sign the addendum, but let's talk with legal about that for your individual case.
And last one right now is, can we use Adobe to have the contracts electronically?
I'm sorry, electronically signed?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I believe we accept electronic signatures on subcontracts. I mean, you guys are going to be signing your agreement electronically through DocuSign. So I believe that I can't see any reason why we wouldn't accept that for your subcontracts as well, as long as we have copies of all of that. That's cool with us. Any other questions, Meg?
No, that's the last one.
Phew. So we got through subcontracts. Next week, we're going to talk about subawards. And as I said, these are like partner agencies that are providing a part of your program. So the responsibilities of the grantee are very different. And so we'll walk through all of those next Wednesday at 11 o'clock. And you can expect to get the follow-up email this afternoon. Thanks for joining us. Hi, ladies.
Happy Thursday.
Oh, is this recording still? No. Yes, it is. I thought I stopped that.